My name is um, title Emeritus Professor or Professora Emerita Ngāhuia Te Awekotuku, for most purposes abbreviated to Awe. Kia ora, everyone.
Thank you. And I guess I really do need to get a verbal yes that you give permission for me to interview you today and for it to be recorded.
For the purposes of this project, I consent to being interviewed, and I also agree to be recorded here. Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Okay. So let's start with a background about your life. So we've talked a bit about how the interview will work. So what does your career look like, and what are maybe the most, you would deem the most significant lifetime achievements, perhaps?
It depends a lot on whose value systems and what cultural principles a person is considering when I answer that question. I don't know, my life isn't over.
Right.
I'm still working, I'm still doing stuff. It's for others. In the Māori world, we have a saying which is kaore te kumara e kōrero mō tōna nei reka. A sweet potato never ever tells everyone that it's sweet. I've done a lot. I started achieving as a very young, precocious, incredibly motivated child. I was a whāngai. I was adopted by another family from a biological family that was interesting. I'll just say that because my biological family are Māori, but with a grandfather who was who only lasted 2 years in the village, but he was a scientist and a significant Oxford personage in his own right. Oxford University, born and raised there. But he came here, married a native woman, left 2 daughters, and basically went back. So that was my biological background. One of the daughters was my biological mother, and she was quite old when I was born, and my father was in his 60s. My biological father, who was Māori. And so I was, as happened and continues to, taken by a couple as a whāngai child, because they couldn't have children of their own biologically. So I grew up in a really quite interesting environment, because my adopted mother, my wonderful, wonderful mother, and my grandmother were both weavers, musicians, very rich in cultural stuff. And I grew up in a community that was pretty much dominated and impacted by tourism. I grew up in the village of Ohenamutu here in Rotorua, which was the centre of the tourist industry. And that was my PhD. My doctorate was on the socio-cultural impact of tourism on the Te Arawa people, on the people of Rotorua. And the specific focus was on the impact, and this is written between 1975 and 1980, my focus was women. And this was before women's studies and before any kind of methodology or critical theory around Indigenous issues and women's issues. So it was quite challenging. And I won a very bizarre, as I described earlier, they called it a joint doctoral internship to the East-West Centre in Honolulu, Hawaii, on the U-H Mānua campus. And we'd also audit programs. We weren't enrolled, we'd audit relevant summer school programs or weekend events at Berkeley and at Santa Cruz, because these academics were part of the East-West Centre system. So we'd get kind of invited. And and by we, I mean a group of us, Polynesians, couple from PNG, quite a few from Southeast Asia. And we'd get, as intellectually excitable young people of colour and as authentic Indigenous people, we'd get paraded around through these different institutions, which was bizarre, but also for me quite enriching. So blah, blah, blah. So that's my academic background. And I had, growing up, going to school, quite a hard time because my adopted family could not understand my need to write and read.
Right.
That was really alien.
Yeah.
That was alien. So I sort of struggled against that. I never knew my biological family. I never knew until much, much later that in my Māori genealogy and in my white one, there was a strong, very strong consciousness of thinking, writing, publishing, teaching, composing. I didn't know any of that. Came across it much later. It's a bit like an ancestry.com adventure in a way. So I grew up with weavers and they were sublime and they taught me about excellence, but they also taught me about women's and social justice issues in a really acute way. And everywhere I looked, there was shit, there was stuff. The way that Māori women were treated, stories about being thrown out of hotels, never being able to get promoted, even if you worked in a government office for 30 or 40 years and trained these callow young, pimply teenage boys, both Māori and Pākehā, and find them suddenly your bosses. And those were the experiences of many of my aunts. Yeah. And so as a teenager, I was a really, I don't know, it sounds a bit poncy now, but I was quite a critical thinker, and there were just things happening that I didn't like. And one of the funny stories from that period is when I was I'm nearly 74. I will be 74 years old in a few weeks. So that gives you the period in which I grew up.
Yeah.
And Fraser MacDonald, when I was in the upper sixth, wrote this article on suburban neurosis affecting middle-class white women. And this is a true story. I actually wrote him a letter and said, what about Māori women? And many years later, his wife, Jackie Fahey, who's a stunning visual artist, mentioned that to me. And it was just hysterical. It was like, oh, well, he got my letter. That's really good.
Right.
Because he never replied. And but they talked about it a lot because they thought it was rather curious that this sixth former from Rotorua wrote a letter. But yes, I was always kind of in there doing radical things, constantly questioning. I was a lesbian, and that was challenging too, because although there are a lot of non-binary people in my community, certainly the women tended to be very sporty and masculine leaning, and whereas I was fair, and my grandmother would never let me cut my hair, and I hated sport, so I was a bit of an aberration.
Yeah,
but I got to Auckland, you know, I wasn't a I didn't fit anywhere, which is fine because that really sharpened my activism. So I ended up at Auckland at the university, blah blah, big long story, which is published in a number of different books and anthologies. Probably the most wonderful, which, and I recommend you get it, is and it's got Ngā Parehopa's story, the first Māori woman PhD, is this rather brilliant book called Fire That Kindles Hearts, 12 Māori scholars, 10 Māori scholars, Fire That Kindles Hearts, edited by Selwyn Katene, Katene, and there are 4 females in it, and including me, and it's, you know, much better than me repeating what's in the book, but it's and it also includes luminaries like Rangi Walker and Sir Mason Dury. And it's academic biography, and it's actually really good.
Thank you.
So that'll background me rather than me babble on about all this. So that's background on my life. I grew up in a house with the Māori language, with a really active community and cultural and tribal, I emphasize tribal consciousness. And yet I had all these kind of other things going on, like the fact that I was gay, that I couldn't stop answering questions, that I really wasn't interested in boys, and that from the third form, I had my eyes set on going to university. Like that was my big goal. I really wanted to get there, and I did. So, and then when I got there, geez, it was crazy. It was insane. It was Auckland, sex, drugs, rock and roll, the halcyon days of government supporting tertiary education. So if you were a clever kid and if you were disciplined, then you would get grants and bursaries and scholarships that would pay your fees. And if you were up in the A pass category, then you had your accommodation covered. I mean, and it was a time when if you didn't get a full scholarship, you could basically, if you're a female, wash dishes at any of the restaurants in downtown Auckland and get enough money for one night's work to pay your rent for the week. And as well as that, take all the food home that you wanted. And the boys, and that's what the girls did. The boys would go to the wharves on a Saturday morning and seagull. They would be working on the docks. And made a hell of a lot more than we did washing dishes. But, you know, it was a very different university environment. We were so privileged. We were also really excited by what was happening internationally, even though, of course, we were here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, way down in the South Pacific, dependent primarily on a very flaky, shadowy, strange television that not many people had in those days.
Oh, Lord,
you know, covered in snow, and it was really bizarre.
Yeah.
Or else print media,
Yes.
you know, which in those days, the Herald, the Star, the Dominion, Christchurch and Otago had, you know, really quite interesting accounts of Vietnam, of civil rights in the US, of different struggles, and of course the freaking bullshit going on in South Africa, which is what drew me in as a Māori kid in Auckland in 1966 with the No Māori, No Tour issues, and a group of really brave Māori students like Sid Jackson, Hone Ngata, and Maxine Rewiti, who organised the Māori, No Māori, No Tour movement, which I kind of jumped in on, although I was 17 and really naive and didn't have a bloody clue, but it was so exciting. And of course that rolled into Vietnam and of course civil rights and a whole bunch of other stuff, which inevitably, and I remember so clearly our first meetings in Auckland, when the English British book Notes from the Second Year and Robin Morgan's Sisterhood is Powerful turned up at Resistance Bookshop, that was the centre of the Auckland Revolution in early 1970. And that's when, and because we were students, but we made the cups tea and we ran around and worked on the gestetners and did the typing, and all the men ran around, you know, assholes like Tim Shadbolt, and were actively famous.
Right.
And we were the workers.
Yeah.
And it was like, no, this isn't good. And so a group of us began, we attempted Auckland women's liberation in the university in late 1970, had our first meeting, and were literally chased out and verbally assaulted. Nobody got groped or touched or hurt. But the first meeting we called was invaded by the engineering students.
They were all men, of course. Yeah.
Of course they were. And they thought it was hysterical, and they thought that we were just a bunch of girls that needed sorting out. And then over that summer of 1970-71, another group formed, and they were primarily young mothers, school teachers. But in those days, if you got pregnant and became a mother, you gave up your career and you couldn't finish your teacher's training. You were stuffed.
Yeah.
You know, even at that time, you could not open a bank account without your father's or your husband's signature. You know, I mean, Christ, it was like goddamn Taliban.
Right, yeah.
You know, and this was Aotearoa, New Zealand 50 years ago.
Right,
Anyway, those are the sorts of things that we were up against. And then when varsity began in 1971, we started agitating. Susan Kedgley appeared from Wellington.
Right,
and all of that's recorded in her memoirs and her book, 50 Years of Feminist. So I don't have to repeat that, but I was very much part of that. But as a queer, as a gay woman, even though I had a couple of extremely unsuccessful attempts at seeing what it was like on the other side of the fence, it never worked. But as a gay woman and a Māori, Tamatoa started at the same time as women's liberation, and I kind of moved between both organisations.
Yeah.
And doing my MA, finishing my master's at the same time, which was a bit insane. And I was doing it in English and art history, which was even more bizarre.
Janet,
and
right? It's
horrific. Yeah, horrific. I wanted to do Hone Tūwhare.
Oh, yes.
And was told that there was he published nothing of worth. And what on earth did I want to do something like that for? And then I fought to do frame, and then I had no supervision, and I am deeply ashamed of that thesis. It's shocking. I learned, though, in that experience how not to treat a graduate student.
Yes.
Because in English, in the department, where sexism was absolutely rife, where sexual dallying with students was ubiquitous and normal, where some of the greatest intellectual powerhouses in a generation in really obscure topics were never promoted because they were female. And we only had one extremely eccentric aging medievalist called Annie Shepherd, who only made it to Aspro, and that was with a struggle.
Oh, Lord. Yeah.
They didn't have full professors, females, at the University of Auckland until the 1980s. That is how vile it was. And it was like, where the hell are our role models?
Yeah.
You know, and being a Māori female, well, Jesus, you know, they just didn't exist.
Yeah.
And if they did, they were doing social work. Right.
Understood.
You know, so anyway, I don't know how I got onto that. Anyway, so Auckland was a real crucible of roiling political energy, and I became disillusioned with feminism.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that actually. If I could just sort of jump in there, you spoke a little bit about your working between maybe feminism and Maori activism. So Has that always, does that remain a sort of a conflict, or what happened? What you became disillusioned? What happened after that?
Well, I was only briefly disillusioned.
Oh, okay.
Not completely. I mean, I still actively carry the word. I'm still a feminist activist. And that's primarily because we live in a patriarchy. We live in a patriarchy, whether it's Aotearoa, New Zealand, whether it's decorative, high achieving, fabulous, globally acclaimed, recently resigned Prime Minister, female, and before her Clark, Helen Clark.
Yes.
And then, of course, Jenny Shipley, and this kind of celebration of a female Governor General and a female Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a female head of whichever corporations and banks and blah, 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 blah. That is such thin flattery, and in no way does it actually question or subvert or interrogate or change. In my opinion, this is just my opinion, the basic tenets of patriarchy that sit beneath the surface.
Right.
You know, and until we can change that, and you know, you've got what is happening in the Middle East, what is happening in the Ukraine, what is going on in South Asia, and you know, until we can shift that, and until the likes of Trump and the Proud Boys and half the assholes that protested at Parliament in in March last year, February, March last year, you know, until they understand the brutality, the misogyny, the hatred of their own belief systems, the planet is fucked.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and so it's my job as a successful academic, as a raging feminist, and more importantly, as a Māori woman living in what is actually a traditional and tribal environment.
Yes. Yeah.
Where we have very gendered roles. It is my responsibility, or one of the reasons I'm here on the planet, to try and question that, expose its weaknesses, find a way of changing it. How do I change it? In my own way, through my work. I worked until I got the gold card in 2013, 14. I worked as a university teacher. I did that job because I had an immense sense of privilege, being paid huge salaries to work and be with and talk to, and more importantly, listen to the next generations of young female and Māori thinkers and scholars and professionals. And for me, that was a massive investment of time and energy. I have to mention someone else, two other people here who really had a significant impact on my intellectual life. And this is in the straight Pākehā world, not the Māori world, because I'm going to talk about my Pākehā journey, not my Māori one. The two people that really were outstanding as thinkers, as initiators, as magical beings were the extraordinary professorial combination of Jim and Jane Ritchie, and particularly Jane.
Yeah.
Jane Ritchie, I honour as one of the founders of second wave Aotearoa New Zealand feminism.
And it's not a name you hear a lot.
No, and yet if you go back to the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, who was publishing, who started women's studies, the very first major in a New Zealand academic institution, who got all that moving, who was responsible for the criminalising of physical punishment of children in the home, you know, who kicked off a hell of a lot of changes in broadcasting and in the academy and in the preschool movement, who actually, and this is a really important one, I want to say this, got a research grant to look at Māori children's learning, particularly preschool children, and with her neighbours and the mothers and the grandmothers and the aunties of Māori staff at University of Waikato, started in 1972, 73, the very first preschool at University of Waikato on campus for Māori children, in which the language of instruction was Māori, and the untrained, unqualified, absolutely inspiring teachers were the grandmothers and the mothers and the aunties. And that was the beginning of Kohanga Reo, and that was Jane. And she got written out of the history. She got written out. And yet I think that so much of feminist intellectual history here in Aotearoa can be tracked back to her. I mean, people will make comments like, oh, but she was a beagle hole. Well, yes, she was a beagle hole. And her mother was Pearl. And she is part of an impressive intellectual dynasty. But she is the most extraordinary woman. She's still around, she's still writing, she's still doing stuff. She lives in Raglan. She'd be worth checking out. She is amazing. And
I had no idea.
And her colleagues at Waikato at that time included other luminaries like Margaret Avery, Rosemary Seymour, Charlotte, I can't remember Charlotte's surname, who was a lecturer in chemistry. There was a group of really interesting academic women at Waikato. Gabrielle Day, Paul Day's wife. I mean, there were women there, Pākehā women, who were absolutely visionary and really brave. They really were. And here at Auckland, there was also a community of feminist academics, but they weren't as feisty and outrageous as the ones at Waikato. I've got to say that. There was also a strong gay element at Waikato, led by two geographers, human geographers, Annie McGee and Lynn Starr. So there was at that time a lot of good stuff going on, and
if I could interrupt you, let's get back to you. What's so we're in your. So I want to ask you a specific.
I'm finishing the pair. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
and that is so your gay identity, your identity as a lesbian woman. There's the famous story, and I'm sure my colleagues in the States would actually like to hear the story of
the visa.
Yeah, the visa. Yeah.
Oh well, that I was finishing the MA, and I was active in Ngā Tamatoa and in women's liberation, and kind of constantly questioning heterosexual privilege, and even in the Māori context, and the racism, and for me, the objectification of me and my girlfriends, because we were gay, and we were queer, and we were peculiar, and we were camp, and da-di-da.
Oh, right.
And this opportunity came up, and so I applied, I was nominated, I applied, and I got it. And it was a State Department funded, and by this stage, I'd gotten married to a dear friend whom I still occasionally have contact with. And that was another whole story about his mother and things being crazy, and both of us not being able to say no to her. So we got married, and it was stupid because within a month of being married, I fell into bed with a rather charming female friend, and realized then that it was a real mistake. It was a mistake. But we were still mates, and still occupied the same house, but I moved into another flat. Anyway, with my new girlfriend. Anyway, I applied for what was called a student leader grant, and I got it. And the basis of my application, because they asked what you wanted to do and what groups you wanted to meet with and what campuses, and I was interested in the Panthers, in the gay liberation movement that was emerging then, and most importantly, in the American Indian movement that was based on the East Coast. So my sort of spread was basically between both coasts, between San Francisco, Black Panthers, and gay stuff, lots of gay stuff happening in San Francisco, and then New York, and the treaty nations of the East Coast. And I got it.
Nice, yeah.
And summarizing it, suddenly there was dead air. Like, nobody contacted me. I was supposed to have meetings at the consulate, da-di-da, and then it was kind of leaked in about January. I was supposed to leave for the States in March 1972, and by December the previous year, I'd heard that there were problems, and then by January, the problems were described, and it's that the Americans were reluctant to grant me a visa because I was not appropriate material for their scholarship. And then someone else who was part of the negotiating between NZUSA, who were part of the program. It's New Zealand University Students Association, and Foreign Affairs, and the Americans kind of leaked the information that the problem was my sexuality. And so I thought, well, I don't believe any of this shit. And by then we were very feisty and brave, and we were doing a lot of work, particularly as tamatoa. And it was just after the 1972 big protests at Waitangi.
Right.
And we were really quite bold and ready to outrage. And so I decided I was going to go personally to confront the American consul. And this is true, this is not made up. And so I got 2 escorts, and one was a relative who at the time was doing his science degree, and is a very tall, good-looking, dark Māori with a massive afro, and he wore a leather jacket and dark glasses. And the other person that came with me was Hannah Te Hemata Jackson's brother, Patrick, who was so effeminate and dainty and articulate and very funny, and, you know, with a mass of shoulder-length curls, and definitely non-binary. So we went to the consul and asked to see him. And my relation with the APRO just basically folded his arms and kind of assumed the role. And we had to get through armed guards and, oh, Jesus. Anyway, we got into the consul because we'd been protesting outside it for so many months against Vietnam.
Yeah.
But we got in, they let us in. And oh my goodness, I met this dude and he had flags all around him. And he had this folder and he opened it and he cited the section and he said, "You have been refused." Now, what's he said? Something like, "The scholarship opportunity has been withdrawn. We are refusing you a visa on the grounds of known sexual deviance."
Oh, Lord.
And
1972, yeah.
Yeah, 1971 was when I was being outrageous, and published an article in Crackham entitled "Lesbianism, the Elegance of Unfettered Love," and I argued that as a feminist position. This is July 1971. I was writing stuff like that. And it was a way of getting back at all the straight girls. But anyway, I was absolutely incandescent with rage. And with the 2 boys, we very graciously exited and rushed up Albert Park, and Tim Shadbolt, thank God, wasn't around that day.
Right.
Usually at lunchtime they'd have an open mic, and Shadbolt and his mates would grab the mic and show off and jump around and basically spout a lot of sexist nonsense. And I grabbed the mic, it was free, and said, explained what had happened, said I was a known sexual deviant, exclaimed that we needed a gay liberation movement here and now, and who was willing. I actually said, the words I used was, which ones of you are mad enough and brave enough to come and talk with me? And I'll be at the coffee bar downstairs, and there was this little pokey, dark, gruesome place underneath the stairs in the Stalinist style university student union. And so I sat there with Patrick, Hannah's brother, and by then my cousin had gone off. He didn't want to have anything further to do with people like that.
Right.
And about 8 people came.
Wow.
And around that time, I was in a relationship with someone really significant. This is another big name, Katarina Denave.
Right.
And she and I were living together.
Right.
And we called the first meeting at a house we were sharing with a group of other senior students. And at the first meeting, we got over 40 people.
Wow. So
I mean, there was a need. And the Homosexual Law Reform Society was still going, but because it was profoundly illegal for men, there was still a really high risk in coming out. But that's how gay liberation began. And then I finished the MA, couldn't get a job, blah, 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 and then kept activating, doing major kind of, or not so major, but I remained very much a feminist and Māori activist. I was beginning to compartmentalize. And I think that's a really important admission that those of us living at the centre on the intersections of sexuality, of ethnicity, of language, of age, of all those things. One of the principal strategies, I believe, of survival was to just line everything up very neatly in parallel boxes. I really believe that. And that's how I've survived. That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
If I'd let them enmesh and engulf me, I would be dead.
Yeah.
Like so many of my mates, like so many women and men I know. But I just kind of separate it all out and be absolutely mindful and focused on whatever life I was living at that time.
Right. It's a strategy. Obviously, you're still with us.
Yeah.
So it's a strategy.
Yeah, it worked.
Yeah.
And it worked for others in the movement.
Yeah.
Particularly Māori and Pacifica and gay. You know, because that's just what we did. Anyway, so off I went to Hawaii. How did I get into the United States? I changed the name by deed poll. And this is pre-computers. Yeah. I don't know if it's, you know, a good thing to say, but I am talking about 50 years ago. And also, my visa crisis was during the Nixon period. Right. It was very different.
Yeah, yeah.
And when I applied the second time around with my new name, which I had changed, it was actually given to me by the tribe in 1974 when I graduated with an honours degree in English and art history. I didn't want to be my adopted name, and I did not want to be the married name. Okay. And I went back to my biological family and my iwi and said, this is a good degree, it should have a Māori name.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was really arrogant and brave and kind of reckless, but I didn't quite put it like that. I was much more humble and genuinely needy. And the old people got it. They got it, and they gave me the name I had. That's how I got it.
Yeah.
So that went into the application process with a whole lot of glowing recommendations from people like Jim and Jane Ritchie,
Right.
and others, and Jane's an American citizen.
Oh, okay, right.
So I got through the process and ended up in Hawaii, and that was really interesting because during that period, when we were doing the auditing of other campuses as part of the program, I checked out the feminist networks in the States, and they were so white. It was horrible. It was just hideous. It was like, oh, no, not my idea. And I won't name them. I was at Berkeley.
Right.
I went in, and then I heard that, there was this, I'd heard about them, the Daughters of Bilitis.
Right.
A very almost legendary lesbian circle based in San Francisco. So I went to one of their meetings, and again it was like it was like, oh my, it was like, what? And there was lots of social stuff, like in Hawaii and in those other American cities. There was an enormous, pumping, intense gay social scene.
Yeah.
And booze was flowing in rivers, and everybody was stoned, and it really was a crazy time. And kind of stern blue stocking feminists that stood away from all that and wanted to confer and plan and stuff. They were all Pākehā. They were all white Anglo-Saxon Protestant women. Well, not my cup of tea, and certainly not my ideological and class origins, because my background, although my biological family, as I said earlier, is quite posh, I never knew them. My upbringing was with weavers. I had my first job as a cleaner when I was 11, 12.
Yeah.
We had to work. Yeah. And if you were super clever to get to university, you could get a good scholarship, which is, what I managed to do. But so yeah, I was kind of staggered by the whiteness of it. It was really funny. It really, and of course, then I'd sort of leave these strange gatherings of pompous feminist women and shabby white females wearing dungarees and big boots, and fall back into my academic cohort of Samoans, Tongans, Tahitians, Filipinos, Vietnamese. Mainly men. There were a few women, so it was quite different.
So how did you ever manage to blend that? I mean, I'm thinking, like, I know I'm asking for
not till much later. Because during my period in Hawaii, and that was from 1975 to 1980, with an 18-month really intense fieldwork phase where I was based here. It was about 18 months, almost 2 years. I came back to Rotorua to actually get my material, and I interviewed all of my great aunts. The youngest would have been 65. And these were women, and my aunts and my great relatives who had been involved with tourism from 1900.
Gosh.
So it's a really significant thesis in a way, because I wrote it for their stories, and I wrote it so that the material can go back to their families, which it has. I'm pleased to say it has.
Yeah.
But so I was here for nearly 2 years, and the women's scene in Hawaii was again quite fragmented, although there was also a lot of crossing over. The Hawaiians, the Samoans, the Tongans, the local women, gay women, were very working class, incredibly rough, heavy drinkers. And that's who I ran with when I didn't attend lectures and be an academic. And in the university context, there were some really quite remarkable women, primarily in the arts faculty, and they included Marilyn Harmon, who taught English, and Adrian Kepler, ethnomusicology, anthropology, and Alice Dewey, who was in anthropology and was part of the Dewey dynasty. And this, did I say, and Barbara Smith, who was extraordinary and an outstanding musicologist. So that was kind of over there. And then there was all the gay stuff over here, and all the rough girls and the drinkers and the party girls, and these, the sort of major social life, gay life.
Right.
And I was sort of caught up in the middle of all that, doing stuff, and then came back here, and what was raging like a fire in Aotearoa, New Zealand, having convulsed itself through a whole series of other things around Auckland and Wellington, and feminism, and the first convention, and then the 1975 Women's Convention in Hamilton, which I missed. Was it 75, the International Women's Year? We had Margaret Mead come up and speak, and she came at the invitation of Jane Ritchie.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And Jane was the convener of that convention.
Wow.
That's why she is a key figure.
Yeah, yeah.
But I wasn't here for that. But during that period, we saw really weird shit happening. And I'll just say, the violence, the racism, the craziness, the extreme positioning of separatism, lesbian separatism, according to Charlotte Bunch, and who came here and preached it, who actually came here and ranted and raved and captured this busload of dizzy white lesbians. Margaret Mead came, There were a whole sort of series of them, but for much of that time, I was in Hawaii,
Right.
and I was in California. There was also, by the time I came back in 1980, the emergence of what became known as the Black Women's Movement. That was a total transplant from San Francisco and the extreme oppression of women of color.
Yeah.
And, you know, throughout my my feminist intellectual life, I have been drawn to and fascinated by the thinkers who are women of color, but also thinkers and writers who are women of First Nations origin, who are Native. And there are so few of us.
Yeah.
There are so few of us, and we end up being captured and manipulated and exploited and seduced by trips to the United Nations and trips here and trips there. And we actually lose sight, many of us, of the job.
Yeah, doing the work. Yeah.
Yeah, which is basically reflecting upon and improving and empowering and uplifting our own women. And for me, that's the big lesson. That's the big job.
So getting us back to what is supposed to be the first question of this interview.
Oh God, no.
We'll truncate. We'll because you've answered
work
already. So would you say that that's maybe not your most significant lifetime achievement, because as you say, you're still living, you know, you haven't finished yet. So far, what would you say is the most you've perhaps, the thing that you are most proud of, perhaps?
No, I really don't know.
So maybe we should go back and sort of like, so what do you
read this?
I'll read that. So what are you working on now? And it's you.
Oh,
so
okay, yeah. Okay, that's
Hawaii, and you had this whole like intersection of like the whole cultural and
Okay,
and,
I'll okay, I came back.
Yeah.
I got the PhD. I also got incredibly ill, but I got the degree. It was the first to be awarded by a New Zealand university. So it was conferred on me at the request of the tribal elders in my grand house in the meeting house Tamate Kapua, and the University of Waikato Council and people from Hawaii, and everybody came, and it was an incredibly, stupendously magnificent day. And I was very, that was a huge one. And because I was so ill, it happened some months after I got the degree, like after I'd passed it and it was all there. But I was in and out. I actually had a bout of cancer, which was removed. It was all taken away, so I'm good.
Okay, good.
But I it was quite close.
Yeah.
Anyway, and of course at the same time the Springbok tour was raging and da-di-da, but I didn't get involved in that. I was quite cynical and would say things like, I think our lives would change if all these angry white people would come out and march with us to Waitangi.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, yeah. But rugby, hey, rugby, it's New Zealand's sort of,
I know, but it's all safe to stuff phone books up your jersey and wear a crash helmet and run around shouting for people, for human rights, for land and language and justice and good health in another country. What about here?
Yeah,
what
yeah.
about here?
Yeah.
And that's what I'd say. And of course, I'd just get kicked out the door.
Yeah. Yeah.
How incredibly unfashionable. How incredibly narrow. Who the fuck are you to tell us what we should be doing?
Oh Lord.
What sort of protester are you?
Oh yeah. Oh yes.
And I thought, I'm not going to get my head broken open for someone and be bleeding all over the ground for a population that's thousands of miles away, when I see the grief and the poverty and the injustices and the arrests going on here. No, it didn't make sense.
Yeah.
And I try and say that to people and they still think I'm being politically unsound. Well, hey, tough, I don't care. That's why I never went on. I went on one march here in Aotearoa because we needed the people. Right. But Auckland, Hamilton, showing off, jumping up and down, putting a phone book up my jersey. Nah. There were other more immediate, and did all that action in South Africa in any way impact on social justice here in Aotearoa? That's still quite debatable, even though we have made a lot of progress. But anyway, coming back to our sorry, that was a bit of a diversion. So when I got cancer, this is important.
Okay, all right.
I wrote to Audre Lorde.
Oh, you did?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Because she had just published the Cancer Journals, which was about her experience as a Black woman in the medical system.
Oh, Lord.
Although her disease was in a different part of her body from mine. Mm-hmm. But I and we ended up corresponding.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Mm.
Oh, wow. And did you have similar stories of the medical world? And
yeah, we did. Yeah, except that mine was diagnosed early enough and it was all removed. Mm-hmm. But the story was just take it all out. This is long before laser surgery and all that. This is 1981.
Yeah. So I was trying to get at, I guess my question was the experience of the medical profession. And this isn't in the script, and this is totally off script. But was there anything interesting about your experience? Were you treated fairly and listened to?
Why I'm smiling like the Cheshire cat is that I demanded a female gynecologist, and I got one.
Wow.
And she was brutal and homophobic and ghastly. Oh shit, she was awful. And it was so ironic. She was an absolute lesbophobe and quite a famous woman too. And I promptly ran back to the tired old white man and his young house surgeon, who was very, very good. The young house surgeon, who was a trainee ob-gyn guy, was really good. He was this little Jewish guy that was really good at his job and really compassionate, and he absolutely got what had happened to me with this ghastly old woman and all her stainless steel equipment and freezing cold hands and all of that. Yeah, I had cervical and uterus, and went through two lots of surgery. And this ghastly old woman was just.
I'm so sorry.
And you can see she preferred to work with ladies that had lots of babies and that were, good heterosexual mothers.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And I was the kind of wild creature that came in wanting to be examined by a woman.
Well, you got what you asked for, I guess.
Yeah, but it immediately set up a really ugly dynamic, because how dumb of me, how dumb is that? God. But anyway, these two blokes did a good job.
Okay,
and
good.
I'm here to tell the story.
Good.
So yeah, how do we? Oh yeah, because I was sick and
you got your degree, and I'm trying
got
to
the degree, and
so your more work hasn't been necessarily feminist focused, has it? It's been more sort of.
Oh, it's always no.
Okay,
oh God.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that I got the PhD. I was unemployable. It took me 4 years to get a job. I was the only Māori woman in the country with a doctorate. And I applied for something like 27 jobs. Never got in. They appointed Maori boy with a BA. It was one of the most difficult periods of my life. It was. And anyway, then I ended up working I landed on my feet very fortunately as the curator at the Museum of Art and History in Hamilton, and worked. I did get a postdoctoral fellowship to Oxford, but that was a year. So I was in Britain then. And even that, which was hugely prestigious, didn't get me a job. I applied for all these museum jobs. I applied for Maori studies jobs. I applied for lectureships and tutorships and blah-de-blah. Nothing. Civil service jobs, nothing.
How did you sustain yourself through 4 years of not getting a gig? I mean,
what? Nearly 4 years. I cleaned motels. I went on the dole for a short time and was almost physically violent at the dole office because the woman that interviewed me did not believe I had qualifications, and I had to take in my degrees. And actually I didn't. I walked out. I just thought, fuck you. I dived. This is really funny talking about this, but I dived for aga with my cousins. I stayed with my family at Maketu on the coast in the Bay of Plenty, and we'd dive for this special seaweed, and we'd go out there and do that. I did that for a couple of seasons. I picked and packed kiwi fruit.
Gosh.
I did a lot of motel cleaning.
Oh Lord.
It was hard.
So,
and I had a doctorate. I had a PhD.
I know.
And through that whole time, I'm walking around saying to myself, tell me, where is the pot of gold at the end of the PhD rainbow.
Yeah.
For me, for a lesbian Māori female, doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And that's what, you know, and that was hard. But I mean, I just kept going. You know, I just had a brilliant mummy, had good friends.
That was what I was getting at, actually. How did you sustain yourself? Like
Emotionally, had a good whānau around me, and had real old time lesbian feminist friends from the early days that kept me going, even though it was a really fractious time in the New Zealand feminist environment, with the catastrophic melodramas around broadsheet, with the Pākehā Congress, which I went to in February 1978 and watched the brutality and manipulation of all these scatty white women by Māori women whom I had no respect for at all, not at all. And Rebecca Evans and Donna Aotearoa are still out there bullying and buggering about with Pākehā women eating out of their hands. You know, I mean, Jesus, I saw what happened at the Pākehā Congress and was so relieved that immediately after that, I went back about 2 weeks after Pākehā, I went back to the States. Because I think if I'd stayed here, I would become very angry very quickly.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
No, I was with the really unhealthy developments I observed when I'd come home to do field work was the elevation, financial support, and almost cosseting by wealthy middle-class white feminists of a renegade group of really obnoxious Māori.
Right.
And I could name the names and tell you who the misguided, well-meaning, genuinely good Pākehā women were. Some of them are still here, and many are still in considerable positions of power.
Yeah.
And it's like the whole issue of white guilt, white privilege, and to a lesser extent, heteronormative and heterosexist privilege was really manipulated brilliantly by particular female leaders, Māori and Pākehā, but particularly Māori and Pacific, and it just blew me away. And it was like, I can't stand this shit. So I was writing to Audre Lorde. I found my way again to North America and hooked up with Beth Brandt, Native American poet, Paula Gunn Allen, Native American poet, both feminists. Paula Gunn Allen was with Judy Graham, who's a very famous lesbian poet. Michelle Cliff was with Adrienne Rich.
Yeah.
Like these are luminaries in the American feminist scene. And I kind of wrote to them and hung out with them and blah, blah, blah. And then coming back to my work, I ended up in the museum sector, which I've returned to, like I'm back there now.
Yeah.
I ended up working in the academy, was offered a job by University of Auckland to start a Māori and Pacific art history program.
Yeah.
And that was in 1988. But up until then, I was also kind of in very rich contact with a number of Native American and to a lesser degree Black feminists.
Right.
And I've got lots of stuff published in different anthologies and collections through those years. Poetry, short fiction, and kind of essays.
Yeah.
And then I published my own collection of short fiction in 1989, and then did a monograph on Māori research ethics.
Yes.
And Mana Wahine Māori, Māori women's politics and art and stuff in 1991. So it kind of predated the likes of Linda Smith and co. I was years before them.
Right.
But so, I was alone. I was by myself.
Yeah. So you had a...
I was queer. No, that was part of it. I was a lesbian. You know, I wasn't safe. I don't care now.
There really is no categorizing you. I was just thinking, like, you know, you started with Janet Frame and then you moved to, you know, like your life and your art, your work and your life have changed so much, but they really are interwoven. So this gets back to your, you know, your beginning.
And the consistency, like the thread that weaves through, the river that runs through is, I'm going to say it, is to my commitment is to constantly challenge, and if I can, in my lifetime, change patriarchy, is to interrogate, expose, shift that value system. And I know it's, you know, it's like howling at the moon, or you know, it's huge picture, it's global picture. But I just think in small ways, in tiny ways, on the marae, as I had recently, in the context of teaching Māori girls at the local high school, you know, how we dress, why do we dress a certain way? I mean, these are interventions, these are ways of interrogating that way of thinking. In my tribe, women have to take their shoes off to go into a carved house. Men do not.
Okay.
They're allowed to keep their shoes on because they're men. Why? Because they're men. There's no rationale.
Yeah.
Except they've got a pair of balls.
Right.
Now, that's what it's become. But there is actually a backstory, which is quite an interesting one, which I won't go into the details of. But at some of the marae with which I have a very strong relationship, the men have to take their shoes off.
Right. Yeah.
And if they don't, then the men inside, who are the speakers, the orators, the chiefs, they tell them to take their shoes off.
Oh. Yeah.
And that's the kind of shift I'm talking about. It's working towards that. And, you know, I think that all of the issues of social justice, of poverty, of inequality, of 21st century life have their roots in the patriarchal system and the patriarchal male power over control, Trumpian excess and ideology, all of it tracks itself back to powerful white men, or powerful men if I consider South Asia and the Middle East and South America and Africa. Yeah.
So
So there you go.
We've not followed the script at all, but you've
No,
on many
all
points,
over the place.
and so I don't really need to ask you the questions, but I wanted to point out, you recently fronted a documentary, is that correct? I've not got a TV, so I didn't see it, and I haven't streamed it yet, but I may well. Can you tell us a little bit about the documentary and how it came about?
Okay, I've worked in the arts sector for a very long time. As I said, my grandmother, my mother, my aunts are weavers, or were weavers of very great renown in the Māori world, and many of the men in my family are carvers and painters. So, and I've always been part of that world, and I've always been creative, but primarily with words. That's my gift. I'm a word person.
Yeah.
I'm a bit hopeless for the blacks, but I'm pretty good with words. And so done heaps of stuff in the arts sector. Helen appointed me to the Council of Creative New Zealand way back in the day when she was PM. And then after that, I became the chair of the Māori Arts Board. So during her tenure, I was one of a group of brave, outstanding, rambunctious Māori and Pacific arts advocates and cultural and heritage specialists who were there during the incredibly productive years of her tenure. It all collapsed when the tenure shifted. And during that time, I did a lot of work at the UN, and particularly in intellectual property and the ownership of Māori imagery.
Right, yeah.
So that's that. And then I kind of got involved. I published a few books on textiles and tattoo and stuff. And but I've always been a performer. Right. You know, I grew up on stage, as well as being a weaver. My family were entertainers. My mother was a backup singer for Howard Morrison.
Oh Lord, I remember.
So that's yeah. He's my cousin. He's close kin. So that's the life I grew up in.
Right. Yeah.
And as a cynic would say, incredibly objectified.
Yeah.
Like we were the safe Māori.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I understand.
That the Pākehā world enjoyed.
Right.
I stepped out of that world.
Yeah.
Because again, I was challenging it.
Yeah.
So I've always done art stuff. Curating exhibitions, helping people, working in art history, working at Elam, doing all that. And so some really charming and absolutely extraordinary people turned up one day in my life and invited me to come into a television series on contemporary Māori and Pacific art. And they'd seen me on different platforms. And I've done lots of stuff internationally. Last year I was in Venice at the Biennale. And that's an interesting thing that connects with what we're talking about. Yeah. In 1992, there was and I think the American audience will find this interesting. In 1992, at the Auckland Art Gallery, we had a major survey show brought from the Chicago Art Institute of the works of Gauguin. So there was a massive Gauguin exhibit, and there was a symposium. And the more I look at Gauguin over the years, from when I was a teenager, the more I'd see my relations who were cross-dressing, transsexual, trans people within the Māori and Polynesian context, which is quite different from others. Anyway, and so I wrote a paper questioning the sexuality and gender, and I posited that Gauguin, a number of his models were whawhawhine, arioi, mahu, trannies. And I showed in my presentation at the symposium, I showed images of Māori and Polynesian queens next to Gauguin's works. And I also did the academic stuff and brought out all the references from the 18th and 19th century voyages and missionaries and stuff about sexualities in the Māori world. I've done a lot of work on that, a lot of published stuff, masses of it out there. And serious academic stuff, I've got to say, just not frivolous, but yeah. And I'll just say that, and part of that was when I was Dean of Māori and Professor at Victoria University, with a bunch of us, we put together a major in lesbian gay studies. And one of the basic programs, basic courses, was on Māori sexualities. That was in the late 90s with Alison Laurie and a bunch of us. There were 5 professors at the university who were all gay. Jack Body's another one, but we were all people of influence in the institution. For 5 years I taught at Vic and was HOD of Māori. Anyway, that's another whole diversion. But I did this paper, and then it disappeared because the book it was going to be part of was dropped for a number of reasons by Chicago and Auckland. So the paper was there, and so I distributed it to my mates, and one of them was Yuki Kihara, and she turned that paper into the Venice Biennale exhibit, which was shown last year and represented Aotearoa, New Zealand. So my paper, which is part of the catalogue of Yuki's show, and which I wrote an epilogue to, I wrote an update because it's 30 years ago. That was the Venice Biennale exhibition for New Zealand. That was the New Zealand Pavilion. So I was up there in November last year, or October last year, working on that.
I'd love to get my hands on that paper, and I'm sure my colleagues in the US would as well. The original.
Well, it's published. It's published. Yuki published it. I'll just get it. I'll get it. 1 minute. What am I doing? Oh, wrong one. Yep. The name of the book
yes.
which was published by Thames and Hudson,
Okay.
which is very posh, is Paradise Camp.
Oh, nice.
Paradise Camp by Yuki Kihara.
Thank you.
And the editor is Natalie King.
Okay.
And the text is my original paper.
Interesting, great.
And it's accompanied by a reflective epilogue where I talk about what has happened in the 30 years since that paper.
Thank you. That would be really, really good, riveting reading. Yes, thanks.
It's mad. It's because of course it immediately falls into the densely controversial and wounding conversation around trans women and TERFs and the endangering, the reinforced alienation of women, of being women. I mean, we are a species at risk, I sometimes think. I do. Even by the very word. In a number of environments, you have to say, I am a cis woman.
Right. Yeah.
And,
yeah.
you know, for a long time in my life, I cross-dressed. Certainly when I was living in Europe and parts of Britain, and before I got this,
right. Yes. Oh, nice.
You know, I had, thank you, I had a number 2 and I'd wear leathers and Doc Martens.
Yeah.
And it was safer to be a guy, certainly in Germany and parts of France. And as I said, parts of Britain, it just was, it was safer. Much safer to be a male.
So can I interrogate, can we go a little further and ask, I would like to ask, so what do you mean about it? What do you mean when you say it's the word woman or being a woman is endangered? What is, can you expand on that a little?
Well, the obvious one is women's toilets.
Oh, right. You know, for me, I always worry, there's a toilet in this house that everybody goes to. Everybody goes to. You know, the cats go to that. You know, they don't use, you know, that's it.
Yeah. But in public spaces, at nightclubs where people are pissed out of their brains or running on chemical fuel, in the public environment, you want to be able to do what you need to do and not encounter someone. I don't know, like for me as a young butch lesbian, I used to use the men's toilets.
Right.
Because the queues in the women's it was so horrific.
Yeah.
But I think that in the current world, which I firmly believe, and this may be an outrageous claim, is funded by pharmaceutical interests, the notion of puberty blockers, of giving a 10-year-old the right to decide what they are, of the kind of revolutionizing of sexual identity is really, really quite critical. And I grew up around people of indeterminate gender in my Māori world.
Yeah.
In my Māori world.
Mm-hmm.
Aunts who dressed and worked and lived like men,
Mm-hmm.
going to Auckland in the 60s, hanging out with the butchers, going to the women's club, which was started by Māori in Karangahape Road in 1971. None of those women, even though they drove buses, they drove trucks, they were butchers, ever identified as men. The idea of their becoming men was actually alien. It's not what they were, women that loved women. Now, what I see happening now is that in a world of options, you can choose. You can choose when you're really young. And yet, for many of us, that choice or that sense of self-identification took decades to complete, took years to settle into. It didn't take surgery and the dropping of God knows how many different chemicals and the rearrangement of the physical body and then the reversion, and then we go on and on and on. So yeah, it's a tricky one, because I do have relatives who are thinking about transition. I have a cousin who became a man and is a very effective male person. And yet knowing the background of that person, I can understand how they would never want to become a woman because a woman is a victim.
Right.
You know, and there's that whole defining and understanding. I mean, it's something that I do think we need more conversation about. But I think that it's I don't know. I mean, for me, the brain is still working on it. I'm still processing it. I meet people who are absolutely rabidly convinced in trans rights.
Right. Or the other way, that there are
and then others who are totally turf.
Yeah.
And for me, my position is I guess it's somewhat fluid, but then I have a cultural position as well as a Māori and as a ritual practitioner. And there are things within my world which only biological women can do, and that is determined at birth by biological sexing. There are some rituals that are unique to us, and I wouldn't like to see it going anywhere else. And what's interesting is that people like the wondrous, lamented late Georgina Bayer and others from her generation and her community would never dream of going there.
Yeah.
As Māori women, trans women, they would never step over that line. They just wouldn't. Whereas I think agitating from the side, there'll be bunches of strange looking individuals in fluffy chiffon frocks with moustaches and bright red lipstick and dangly earrings saying, babe, it's your right, babe, it's your right. You know, and that's where I do question what I see happening out there. I really do. I've just realised we've gone on for a really long time. Well, we can conclude.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much,